Many of you will know of Nick. Nick led an extremely distinguished career, which culminated in him being Chief of the Defence Staff, the highest-ranking military official in the UK. He is a very wise man, and I'm honoured to now work with him as a board member at Apolitical. So, Nick, welcome.
Thanks, Robyn. It's good to be here.
We're going to jump right in. About 18 months ago, you said to me, we are on the foothills of World War III, and anyone who doesn't think that is kidding themselves. Where are we right now?
Well, I think we're probably, sadly, moving from the foothills up into the lower slopes. And I say that for a number of reasons. I think, first and foremost, 2024 was the worst year for conflict. There are more conflicts in 2024 than at any time since 1945. But I also think the way geopolitics are going, where the world is sadly being drawn into spheres of influence, and the competition between those spheres of influence, I'm afraid, is leading to tension in all sorts of directions. But of course, the other aspect of all of this, I think, is when you look at the wars that are very much in our sort of front view at the moment, like Ukraine, they're increasingly becoming globalized. When you look at what Putin's GRU is doing in Europe, you know, a campaign of subversion, sabotage, occasionally attempted assassination, penetrating NATO airspace, cyber, disinformation. And then that goes as far as Africa, where we saw last year Wagner, now Africa Corps Russian ex-soldiers, being killed by Tuareg rebels sponsored by Ukrainian intelligence services. So I fear that this is all getting a little bit less under control than perhaps where it should be, which is why I would say I'm afraid that we're now heading up through the lower slopes.
Right. So...
Very depressing, I know.
Very depressing. So you often explain where we're at now in the context of history and how we got here. You have said before that the modern battlefield is much faster, more lethal, and contested in every domain: space, cyber, land, sea, and air. Can you talk to this and how we got here?
Yes, I think it's just probably worth explaining that word domain, because we've always talked about land, air, and sea. But of course, what has happened as modern technology has enabled it is that cyberspace has become effectively a military operational area alongside other things. And the same for space. Space now is definitely a competitive environment. And US Spacecom, which is probably the leading proponents of warfare in space, were describing only in March this year the extent to which they were observing Chinese satellites maneuvering in space, exercising against each other in synchronicity. And that, of course, is quite a scary prospect, because if you want to have missiles hitting the right targets, your satellites in space make that possible to happen. So it's a huge vulnerability. But I think the real point here is that warfare's really always been about a competition between hiding and finding. And what we see increasingly from the wars that are underway today, particularly in the Middle East, but also in Ukraine, is that finding is now preeminent over hiding. And the upshot of all of that is, if you're a tank commander in the battlefield in Ukraine at the moment, if you expose your tank from a camouflaged position for 5 minutes, you will undoubtedly get struck by several drones. But it's not really the drones that are interesting in that. It's actually the artificial intelligence-enabled software that provides the rapidity with which that strike happens. And that's the bit that we're really seeing changing now. It's the way in which, as John Boyd, a US Air Force, put it some time ago, it's all about the OODA loop. It's all about observe, orient, decide, act. And on a battlefield, the quicker you do that, the more likely you are to defeat your opponent. And that, of course, is where artificial intelligence is so important on the modern battlefield. And that's what's really changing, and that's what's making it more lethal and more contested. It's how that software is applied to the battlefield rather than just the drones that we hear about all day long, the longer range weapon systems, the more precise weapon systems. It's actually the software that makes it work.
And the software has been more and more relied on. That's not without huge risks. You spoke to me recently about a moment in Afghanistan. Can you share that story on signing off on attacks?
Yes, I mean, I think the conversation that needs to be brought on, following on from what I've just said about artificial intelligence, is the ethics of all of this. Because we've always believed profoundly in the West, and particularly in this country, that there needs to be a human in the decision-action loop to make sure that any application of a weapon system is going to be done in a way that is genuinely ethical for all sorts of obvious reasons. And I very much remember 10 or 15 years ago when I was commanding southern Afghanistan, and I had a lot of American drones available to me, what were then called Reapers and Predator drones. Now, these drones could fire missiles and they could drop bombs, and they obviously had sensors that were able to identify targets. And we used to use them a lot to try and monitor routes that the insurgency would put improvised explosive devices onto. And there was one particular road outside Kandahar, in the middle of nowhere really, that we had to use quite often, but was regularly being attacked by the insurgents. And sure enough, we used to fly a Reaper drone over it regularly in the hope that we might pick up somebody planting one of these devices. And I used to have a rule that before we allowed one of these drones to fire its weapon system, that a senior figure, maybe me, but perhaps one of my 2 or 3 US deputies, would have to go into the operations center. And in doing so, they would have to check the target, looking at a rather grainy screen, and then authorize the firing of the weapon. And on this particular day, nobody else was available. So I went into the operations center to authorize a particular shoot that could or could not happen. And I looked at this image on the screen, and you could see 2 figures that were quite clearly working on the road, sort of sandy road. And it absolutely did look, at first sight, like they were digging something into the road. Anyway, there's something about it which I didn't quite like, and I vacillated, despite the operator saying to me, "Come on, sir, come on, it's obvious what's going on here." And I vacillated a bit longer. And then, mercifully, the 2 figures stood up, and they skipped away. And they were kids building a sandcastle. Now, my question, rhetorically, is to what extent will we as human beings have absolute confidence that artificial intelligence will have the experience and therefore judgment that would perhaps make sure that an attack like that wouldn't have happened? And I don't know the answer to that question, but what I do know is that it does illustrate so importantly, I think, the ethical dimension of future warfare. And if we go back in history, you'll remember the Hague Conventions, and you'll remember what happened, as Robyn was alluding to in her opening remarks, when we created the UN and the institutions alongside it. That, of course, created rules of war. And I think we're now at an edge when it comes to the rules of war, and I think if only the globe could come together to think about it.
I have dreamt of that story since I first heard it. So when you say you don't know the answers, but if you were forced to speculate about the mechanisms and the conversations and perhaps the governance solutions that we need to start thinking about to handle those ethical questions, what do they look like? Are they conventions? Are they something else?
Yes, I think it probably is some form of conventions. I mean, to be fair, the UN has started this conversation to a degree, but of course, as we well know, the UN is paralyzed at the moment, and neither of the protagonists in the Ukraine war at the moment want to enter this conversation because, of course, they're hoping to win the war. And that's why they're comfortable with the lack of rules as they pertain to these weapon systems at the moment. But yes, I think it is conventions. I think the tragedy, of course, is so often the case, is that it will take another major conflagration before people are prepared to sit round the table and think about how they generally apply rules to future warfare. And I fear that's more likely to happen.
So you know Ukraine quite well and what's happening in Ukraine, and we're going to hear more from a Ukrainian government official later. But can you say a little bit more about the battlefield now, which you've described as a combination of World War I and World War III, and in particular how we're seeing technology used and what that might say about the future?
Yes, and I think it's important, that point about it being a mix of World War I and World War III, because, of course, what's happened on that battlefield is it's become very static. And that means that the technologies that are proving to be useful on that battlefield are ones that, of course, pertain to a much more static battlefield. And if it became a bit more like World War II and became more mobile and more fluid, then the extent to which drones, which have a maximum range, because so many of them are piloted by individual pilots with fiber optic cables connected to the drone, and that obviously limits the amount of range they've got. Those drones would become probably less significant to the outcome of the battle. Now, I think the other thing one needs to sort of be conscious about is it's also a battle of attrition. And we see that particularly with Russia, who during the course of this year has essentially lost 1,000 casualties a day during the offensives that they've got going on in the Donbass. And of course that has a bearing on Ukraine as well, who, whilst the defender always has an advantage on a battlefield, won't take quite as many casualties as the Russians. But again, the attrition is very much there. And that's why the drone has become such a vital part of what Ukraine is doing, because it can replace human beings. And that's the way they've used the drone on this particular battlefield. Lots of people say, oh, we'll never see a tank ever again. Rubbish. There are tanks being used on this battlefield. The Ukrainians use them for what we call counter-penetration. So if the Russians manage to penetrate the front line, the Ukrainians will use these tanks, a bit like a fire brigade, to go to the problem and counter the penetration that the Russians have got. So one also has to be quite careful about some of the more strident comments one hears about this. But I think the real thing I would say about this particular war is that we military people talk about the character of conflict as distinct from the nature of war. And the character of conflict evolves with technology, which I'll come back to. But the nature of war never changes. It's always visceral, it's always violent, it's always bloody. It's always an engagement between human beings. And wherever the technology takes us, I think, in terms of robotics or autonomy or any of this uncrewed systems that we see, the reality, I suspect, is you're still going to see this ultimately conflict between human beings. And it is a very unpleasant experience. And it's one that once you've been involved in it, you never forget. And I don't think that will change regardless of what the technology brings on over the next 25 years. The question, of course, is what is the right mix of technologies that are going to make the difference in the future? As I said at the beginning, it's always, I think, going to be about software and the analysis that goes into that software, and then the AI that perhaps speeds up the decision action cycle that matters to this. But I suspect that we are increasingly going to see more autonomy, we're increasingly going to see more robotics, and we're going to see increasingly, therefore, more uncrewed platforms. You know, that begs questions for militaries and for governments about where they invest and how that and what that looks like. And incredibly, to my mind, we are still, for example, building manned aircraft or planning to build manned aircraft that will be fielded towards the end of the next decade. And I think that does beg all sorts of good questions about why you would do that and whether or not we're smelling the coffee when it comes to what the future of the air dimension looks like. And it will be the same in the maritime dimension, and it will be the same to a degree in the land domain as well. So I'd have thought it'll be those sorts of combinations. But look out for quantum, because quantum computing is going to get after crypto, and that's going to get after the military's business big time, because we need to be alert to a world in which there will be no secrets in the future. And that will be really quite challenging for all of us, I suspect, when we think about tactics and strategies and how we're going to conduct modern deterrence in the future.
And just on quantum, so one of the reasons we also wanted to have this conversation, although we don't at Apolitical work directly on warfare, is we work in these domains which are now subject to warfare. And quantum is one of them. We're doing a lot of work training officials on quantum computing, and it is terrifying how there isn't investment in securing important data because no one wants to spend the money to do it, and they're hoping to kick the can down the road. So it's by the time it becomes a real problem, it's someone else's problem. I want to just move to the psychology now of leadership. Nick, you've spoken about the risks of having young people who don't remember war making decisions.
I'm not sure it's necessarily young people. I mean, one of the ironies, I think, of the New World Order is it seems to be led by strong men who tend to be septuagenarians. I think the point I would make really is that although history doesn't repeat itself, it has a rhythm. And I think if you look back over history, the tragedy, of course, is every 80 to 100 years, we end up with a major conflagration. And I think my worry would be that so many of our policymakers now are tempted to be quite bellicose in terms of their language without absolutely understanding the point I've just made about the nature of war. And that would be my worry as a military officer who's striven all his life to try and make sure that we don't go to war. And I think that would be the thing that most disturbs me. And of course, we're seeing it playing out vividly at the moment. You know, every time a Russian jet penetrates NATO airspace, you will get normally an Eastern European saying, hang on a minute, we should shoot them down. Well, be careful what you wish for. It may well be that it's appropriate to have a missile lock-on or find some other way of achieving escalation dominance. But if you shoot a Russian aircraft down, it may well be that your opponent is looking for an excuse to do something even worse than what he's done in terms of penetrating NATO airspace. So I think having that understanding of the nature of war and the unpleasantness of it is something that fades in terms of memory. And that's why things like Remembrance Sunday matter. You know, we do need to reflect on all of this. And I think that it's important. It's not so much for the younger generation, it's for, you know, generations that know, all generations now have not experienced war in that same way. And that's, I think, would be my observation, really.
We are going to put up a Slido shortly, so you can share some questions for Nick if you have them. I'm sure many in the room have them. So do just formulate those in your mind. Before we move to those, though, perhaps lifting us out of total despair, maybe a note of optimism. Nick, you have thought and written about what if we treat physical injury and wounds, what if we treat mental wounds as seriously as we treat physical wounds. And you wrote recently in The Spectator about the use of MDMA for former soldiers. Can you share your thoughts on that?
Yes, I shouldn't think there are many Spectator readers in the audience, so I will elaborate. I'm privileged to be patron of a small charity called Supporting Wounded Veterans that was formed, of course, as a consequence of the post-9/11 campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan. And our work to begin with was very much dominated by physical injuries, and we're all vividly aware of that. But of course, what happens over time is that the physical injury bit fades a bit in terms of the incidence of it. And what actually happens is that it's the mental injuries that begin to come to the fore. And it's generally recognized that people with complex PTSD will only start to really see that complex PTSD probably, you know, maybe 5 or 10 years after the event. So many of the veterans who are coming forward for our help now are ones with complex PTSD. And the difficulty, of course, is that traditional treatments, just simply psychotherapy or the like, and some of the drugs that have been available, don't really answer the problem. And what we are discovering, particularly in the United States, where trials of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy have happened quite successfully, MDMA being ecstasy, is that actually you end up getting after what's called the plasticity in the brain if you do this. And the upshot of all of that is that people will tell psychotherapists under the influence of this drug things that they would not otherwise share in traditional treatments. And that's why people think there's between an 80 and a 90% potential success rate in terms of using MDMA alongside expert psychotherapy. And actually, you don't need that many sessions to achieve the outcome. And what I was appealing for in the article I wrote was for our government, and in particular the regulator here, to get on with accepting the trials and the output of these trials so that we can license MDMA-assisted psychotherapy in this country. I hope we'll further afield as well, because there are an awful lot of military veterans, but also people who work for the NHS or the police force, who would benefit from all of this. But unfortunately, it hasn't yet caught the selector's eye in terms of the way the regulator, and for that matter, the government see it. So I was writing an open letter to whoever the Health Secretary is these days. Is it still West Streeting? Anyway, if anybody's got his ear, please bend it.
Can we pull up that Slido, please, whoever's in control? I hear two things a lot from former government officials. One is, here's a long list of things I wish I had done now that I've had time to reflect on it, and you're going to hear some of those later. Another is, now I might be able to experiment with substances like psychedelics released from the strictures of government. Have we got the Slido? Great. So just while people put their questions, and we've got a couple of minutes for those, Nick, obviously governments around the world are all keen to exploit the efficiencies that AI offers. That is requiring new infrastructure, big new automation and augmentation projects. What is your advice to government officials against this backdrop of warfare everywhere when they approach these massive digital projects?
I mean, I think it's well known that our Ministry of Defence, and for that matter, the equivalent organisations in most Western democracies, struggle with acquisition. And we struggle with acquisition because we do tend to think of the outside world as being, in a sense, separate from our own world. And if we could revise our acquisition system so that we partner much more with the tech companies and with industry as a whole, I think we'd have a much better chance of keeping up with technology. Because at the moment, what the Ministry of Defence does is to write a requirement to put it out to industry as a tender, and then maybe a couple of years later, somebody comes back with the best value for money option, and we take it, and by then there's a risk it's obsolete. So finding a way that we can actually work much better with the private sector on a sort of enterprise-type basis would be what I would love to see happen, regardless of the fact that we know we need to be careful about competition rules and everything associated with it. But if we don't do that, I'm afraid we will never have the skills and what we need inside government to make it happen.
All right, so there are a lot of questions. I'm not going to kick off with one about Israel and Palestine. We can see if you feel
Thank you.
brave enough to answer that one later. Oh goodness, there are quite a few about that. If you...
We can if you want to.
Maybe we'll end there. How do you see the future of warfare interacting with challenges around climate change?
I mean, I think climate change leads to greater instability. And I think we see that classically in Africa, where, of course, people move because they have to move because climate change affects where they live. And I think it's that which is the big impact, probably, is what it will lead to in terms of instability, and therefore what it means to our requirement to stabilise and help those populations who are in that sort of difficulty.
There are so many. I think we might have to try and persuade Nick to do an op-ed to answer all of these, but I'm going to rapid fire give a few. Are you concerned about the risk of integrating potentially misaligned AI into military technology?
I'm not sure what you mean by misaligned.
Well, that doesn't have, I guess, humanity's interests writ large.
Yes, I mean, I think we are. I think that's my point about the ethics of AI in relation to weaponry, because I think that it is so fundamental to try and keep some form of human or human-like responsibility associated with using weapons in future warfare.
Looking forward, 2024 saw more conflicts than any year since 1945, as you said. Is that going to be peak conflicts, or do you think we're going to see more over the next, new records over the next decade?
I mean, I think a lot depends upon what I say about miscalculation, because I think tension is ever rising. And when you get tension, and as I was saying earlier, human nature plays into this, I think there's always a risk of a miscalculation, and it'll be the miscalculation which I think will undermine the stability of our world.
Well, on that note, big round of applause for General Carter, please.
Good.